When 12-year-old Charles Carter whispered those words to the Apache tracker, he had no idea he was about to witness a manhunt that would span 3 territories and reveal the darkest secrets buried in the Arizona desert. What started as a simple trip to town for winter supplies would become a blood-soaked trail of vengeance that would change the frontier forever. The sun hung like a copper coin against the vast Arizona sky, casting long shadows across the scrubland that stretched endlessly toward the purple mountains. Dust devils danced in the distance, spiraling upward like the prayers of desperate souls, while the wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day in territory that seemed forgotten by God himself. At the edge of Cedar Ridge, where civilization gave way to the untamed wilderness, sat a small adobe house that Elizabeth Carter had built with her own hands after her husband died of fever 3 winters past. The walls were thick against the desert heat, the windows small and practical, and the roof bore patches where she'd climbed up herself to repair damage from the violent storms that swept across the territory without warning. Inside, 2 children waited by a window that faced the dusty road leading to town. Charles Carter, at 12 years old, had shoulders that carried more weight than any boy should bear, his dark hair falling into eyes that had learned to scan horizons for signs of trouble. His sister Abigail, 7 years old, with wheat-colored braids and a face still round with childhood, pressed her small hands against the glass as she watched for a familiar figure that should have appeared hours ago. "Mama said she'd be back before the sun got high," Abigail whispered, her breath fogging the window pane. "She promised, Charles. Mama never breaks her promises." Charles felt his stomach twist with the familiar knot of worry that had become his constant companion since their father's death. At 12, he'd appointed himself the man of the house, a responsibility that sat heavy on his thin shoulders like an ill-fitting coat. He knew things Abigail didn't, understood dangers that her innocent mind couldn't yet grasp. The trip to Cedar Ridge should have taken their mother 3 hours at most. An hour to ride the old mare into town, an hour to gather supplies and trade the few coins they'd saved, and an hour to return home before the desert heat became unbearable. It was a journey Elizabeth had made dozens of times, always returning with flour and salt and sometimes a piece of penny candy for each child if the trading had gone well. But the sun now blazed directly overhead, marking midday, and still the road remained empty, except for the heat shimmer that made the distant landscape dance like water. "She's just talking with Mrs. Henderson at the general store," Charles said, trying to convince himself as much as his sister. "You know how ladies can talk when they get together." Abigail turned from the window, her blue eyes wide with the trust that only children possessed. "Do you think she found those winter boots she's been looking for? The ones in my size?" Charles nodded, though his attention remained fixed on the horizon. Their mother had been worried about winter for weeks, calculating and recalculating their meager supplies, determining what they could afford and what they would have to do without. The boots for Abigail were a luxury they probably couldn't manage, but Elizabeth Carter would walk barefoot through snow before she'd let her daughter's feet freeze. The afternoon stretched on with the merciless slowness of desert time. Charles tried to distract Abigail with games and stories, but his own anxiety grew with each passing hour. He'd helped his mother harness the mare that morning, had watched her ride away with a kiss and a promise to return with good news about their winter preparations. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Charles could no longer deny the cold fear that had settled in his chest like a stone. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. When darkness fell across the desert like a heavy blanket, Charles made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't wait any longer. Couldn't sit in that adobe house listening to his sister's increasingly frightened questions while their mother remained missing somewhere in the vast wilderness. "Abigail, we're going to find help," he announced, pulling on his father's old jacket that hung loose on his frame. "There's someone who might be able to help us." "Who?" Abigail asked, clutching the corn-husk doll their mother had made for her last Christmas. The Apache who camps by Willow Creek. Mama says he's different from the others. That he helped the Martinez family when their boy got lost in the canyon. Abigail's eyes widened with fear and fascination. Stories of the Apache filled the nightmares of every frontier child. Tales of warriors who could disappear into the landscape like smoke and track a man across solid rock. But Charles had heard different stories about this particular Apache. Whispers that he was a tracker without equal. A man who could read the desert like other men read books. The walk to Willow Creek took them through terrain that seemed alien in the moonlight. Cacti stood like sentinels against the star-filled sky, their arms raised in silent supplication, while night sounds echoed across the emptiness. Coyotes called to each other in the distance, their voices rising and falling like a funeral song, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl questioned the wisdom of two children walking alone through Apache territory. Charles carried their father's old rifle, more for comfort than protection, since he'd never actually fired it, while Abigail stayed close beside him, her small hand gripping his shirt. They followed the sound of running water until they found the creek, a thin ribbon of silver cutting through the black landscape. That's where they found him. Haloke sat beside a small fire that cast dancing shadows across his weathered face, his long black hair braided with leather and adorned with a single eagle feather that marked him as a warrior of distinction. He was a man carved from the desert itself, all sharp angles and sun-darkened skin, with eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of generations who had called this harsh land home. At the sound of their approach, Haloke's head turned with the fluid grace of a predator, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. But when he saw two frightened children emerge from the darkness, his posture relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained alert and assessing. "You are far from your home, little ones," Haloke said in English that carried only the faintest trace of accent. His voice was deep and measured, like distant thunder rolling across empty canyons. The desert at night is no place for children. Charles swallowed his fear and stepped forward, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "We need help. Our mama went to town this morning and never came back. Everyone says you're the best tracker in the territory." Haloke studied the boy's face in the firelight, noting the way Charles held himself protectively in front of his sister, the determination mixed with desperation in his young eyes. The Apache had seen many things in his 43 years, had witnessed the best and worst of both his people and the white settlers who had claimed their ancestral lands. But there was something in this boy's courage that reminded him of his own son, lost to cavalry bullets 5 years past. "Your mother," Haloke said slowly. "What is her name?" "Elizabeth Carter, Lizzie. She rides an old brown mare named Ginger. She was going to buy supplies for winter, maybe some boots for Abigail if she could afford them." Abigail stepped out from behind her brother, her corn-husk doll clutched tightly in her arms. "Mama promised she'd be back before dark. She never breaks her promises, not ever." The absolute faith in the little girl's voice cut through Haloke's practiced emotional defenses like an arrow finding its mark. He had learned long ago to keep his heart protected from the pain of others, had built walls around his feelings after losing his own family to the endless warfare between his people and the expanding white settlements. But looking at these two children, so small and vulnerable in the vast darkness, he felt something stir that he'd thought buried forever. "The town of Cedar Ridge," Haloke said, rising to his full height, which seemed to tower over the children like a mountain. "It is a place where bad things can happen to good people. Tell me, what did your mother take with her besides the mare?" Charles thought carefully, trying to remember every detail from that morning. "Her leather pouch with our winter money. Maybe $15 saved up from selling eggs and vegetables. And Papa's old pistol, the one she keeps loaded since—" He stopped, not wanting to voice the fears that kept frontier families awake at night. Raiders, both Apache and white, who preyed on isolated settlements. Claim jumpers who murdered families for a few acres of worthless land. Outlaws who saw lone women as easy targets for violence that went far beyond simple robbery. Haloke nodded grimly, understanding the unspoken words. In this territory, A woman traveling alone with money was prey to predators of every description. The desert had swallowed many travelers who simply vanished without trace, their bones eventually scattered by wind and scavengers until nothing remained to mark their passing. "I will find your mother," Haloki announced, his voice carrying the weight of an oath. But you must stay here by my fire. The desert will be searched, but not by children." "We're coming with you," Charles declared, his jaw set with stubborn determination. "She's our mama, and we're not just going to sit here while you look for her." Haloki studied the boy's face, recognizing a spirit that would not be easily discouraged. In Charles, he saw the same fierce protectiveness that had once driven him to fight cavalry troops with nothing but a knife and determination. The same love that had made him howl like a wounded animal when he'd found his wife and son's bodies after a dawn raid on their camp. "The trail will be dangerous," Haloki warned. "There are men in this territory who kill for sport, who would see 2 children as entertainment." "Then teach us to be invisible like you," Charles replied without hesitation. "Teach us to track and hide and survive. Our mama risked everything to keep us safe. Now it's our turn to risk everything for her." Abigail nodded solemnly, her small face set with the same determination that marked her brother. "I'm not scared." "Well, I am scared, but I'm more scared of never seeing Mama again." Haloki stared into the fire for a long moment, watching the flames dance like spirits in the darkness. In his youth, he would have sent the children away, would have pursued this quest alone with the cold efficiency that had made him legendary among both his own people and their enemies. But age and loss had taught him that some burdens were too heavy for one man to carry, that strength sometimes came from unexpected places. When he looked up, his decision was made. "We leave at first light, but you will do exactly as I say when I say it, without question or hesitation. The desert does not forgive mistakes, and the men we may face show no mercy to children." Charles nodded eagerly, while Abigail clutched her doll tighter and tried to look brave. Haloki saw the fear in her eyes, the way her small body trembled despite her efforts to appear strong. She was so young, too young for the hardships that lay ahead. But he also recognized something else in her gaze, a steel core that reminded him of Apache women who had defended their families against impossible odds. "There are things you must understand," Haloki continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher passing down crucial knowledge. "In this territory, there are places where law means nothing, where men make their own rules with guns and violence. Your mother rode into such a place, and if she has not returned, it means she encountered something that prevented her from coming home." "You mean she's hurt?" Abigail whispered, her voice small and frightened. "I mean, we will find the truth, whatever it may be," Haloki replied carefully. "But you must prepare yourselves for the possibility that the truth will be painful. The desert keeps many secrets, and not all of them have happy endings." Charles squared his shoulders, trying to absorb the weight of responsibility that was settling on him like a heavy cloak. "We understand. We just want to know what happened. We want to bring her home." "Then sleep now," Haloki commanded, banking the fire until it became a bed of glowing coals. "Tomorrow we begin a hunt that may take us across the entire territory. We will follow every trail, question every soul we encounter, and search every place where a woman might be held against her will." As the children settled beside the dying fire, using their jackets as blankets and pillowing their heads on smooth stones, Haloki stood watch in the darkness. His eyes scanned the horizon constantly, his ears tuned to every sound that whispered across the desert wind. Somewhere out there, Elizabeth Carter waited for rescue or had already passed beyond the reach of earthly help. But Haloki had made a promise, and in his culture, promises were sacred things that bound a man's spirit to his word. He would find Elizabeth Carter, alive or dead. He would bring truth to her children, comfort or closure as fate determined. And if harm had come to her through the actions of evil men, he would extract a price that would be remembered in this territory for generations to come. The night settled around them like a protective embrace, while overhead, The stars bore witness to an oath that would shake the very foundations of the frontier. Before this hunt was finished, blood would flow like water across the desert sand, and the legend of Haloki, the tracker, would grow to include his greatest and most terrible quest. In the distance, a coyote howled once and fell silent, as if the desert itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the violence to come. The desert dawn broke like a blade across the horizon, painting the eastern sky in shades of blood and gold, while shadows retreated into the rocky crevices where they would wait out another day of merciless heat. Haloki had been awake for hours, reading the subtle signs that most men would never notice. The way certain birds avoided a particular stretch of creekbed, how the morning breeze carried scents that didn't belong to this place, the tracks of animals that spoke of disturbances in the natural order. Charles stirred first among the children, his body automatically responding to the hunter's instincts his father had begun teaching him before fever claimed the man's life. Abigail remained curled beside the cold ashes of their fire, her corn-husk doll serving as both pillow and comfort, in dreams that were probably filled with images of their missing mother. "The mare," Haloki said without preamble as Charles sat up and rubbed sleep from his eyes. "Tell me everything about this animal. Her habits, her fears, the way she responds to different situations." Charles blinked in the growing light, his mind still foggy with sleep, but gradually focusing on the Apache's intense gaze. "Ginger's old, maybe 20 years. She doesn't like loud noises or sudden movements. Mama bought her from a ranch that was selling off stock because she was too gentle for cattle work. Gentle horses leave different tracks than spirited ones," Haloki observed, already moving toward the creek to splash cold water on his face. "They step carefully, avoid rough ground when possible. This will help us follow the trail." As Abigail awakened and the three of them shared a meager breakfast of jerky and creek water, Haloki explained his methodology with the patience of a teacher who understood that knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. He showed them how to read the subtle depressions in hard-packed earth that indicated a horse's passage, how to distinguish between tracks made yesterday and those made days ago, how the angle of broken twigs could reveal which direction a rider had been traveling. "Your mother left your home yesterday morning," Haloki said, kneeling beside a clear set of hoofprints near the creek's edge. These tracks were made by a shod horse carrying a light rider, moving at a steady walk toward Cedar Ridge. "The depth of the impressions tells me the animal was not heavily loaded, confirming that your mother carried only supplies for trading." Charles studied the tracks with fascination, amazed at how much information could be gleaned from what looked like random marks in the dirt. "How can you tell all that just from looking?" "The desert teaches those who listen," Haloki replied, beginning to follow the trail that led toward the distant town. "Every step tells a story. Every broken branch carries a message. Your mother's horse walked this path with confidence, which means she felt safe at this point in her journey." Cedar Ridge squatted against the desert like a collection of weathered bones, its buildings constructed from whatever materials the harsh environment and limited resources could provide. Adobe walls mixed with rough-hewn timber, corrugated metal roofs patched with tar paper, and boardwalks that groaned under the weight of boots and the constant expansion and contraction caused by extreme temperature changes. The main street stretched for perhaps 300 yards, lined with the essential businesses that kept frontier life barely functional: a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a combination barbershop and doctor's office run by a man whose medical credentials consisted primarily of having read several anatomy books and possessing steady hands for removing bullets. Haloki approached the town with the caution of a man who understood that his presence would be noted, discussed, and probably reported to whatever authorities claimed jurisdiction over this particular patch of territorial emptiness. Apache warriors, even peaceful ones, were viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility by white settlers who had grown up on stories of savage raids and brutal warfare. "Stay close," he warned the children as they entered the town's outskirts. "Speak only when spoken to, and let me do the talking whenever possible." Some of these people may not react well to seeing an Apache asking questions about a missing white woman. The general store occupied the largest building on the main street, its wooden sign proclaiming Henderson's Dry Goods and Provisions in faded letters that had been repainted multiple times over the years. A bell jangled as they pushed through the door, and the musty smell of stored grain, leather goods, and various chemicals used for everything from cleaning to pest control filled their nostrils. But Ezra Henderson emerged from behind the counter like a man expecting trouble, his pale eyes darting nervously between Haloki's impressive frame and the two children who flanked him. Henderson was a thin, nervous individual whose receding hairline and constantly moving hands suggested someone who had spent years looking over his shoulder. "We don't serve Indians here," Henderson declared, though his voice carried more fear than conviction. "You'll have to take your business elsewhere." "We seek information, not trade," Haloki replied calmly, his hands remaining visible and well away from the weapons he carried. "These children's mother came to your town yesterday morning. She has not returned home." Charles stepped forward, his young face earnest and pleading. "Please, Mr. Henderson. Our mama is Elizabeth Carter. She was going to buy winter supplies, maybe some boots for my sister. You must have seen her." Henderson's expression softened slightly at the sight of the worried children, but his eyes remained wary as they flicked back to Haloki. "Lizzie Carter was here yesterday around mid-morning. Bought flour, salt, some canned goods. Paid in coin, asked about children's boots but decided they were too expensive. What time did she leave?" Haloki asked, noting the way Henderson's gaze kept shifting towards something behind the counter. "Maybe noon, little after. Said she was heading straight home because she didn't want to be riding after dark." Abigail tugged on Charles's sleeve, whispering urgently, "Ask him if Mama seems scared or worried about anything." Charles relayed his sister's question, and Henderson's face took on a troubled expression. "Well, now that you mention it, she did seem nervous about something. Kept looking out the window like she was watching for someone. And when Jake Morrison came in while she was here, she got real quiet and finished her business quick." Haloki's attention sharpened like a blade finding its target. "This Jake Morrison. Tell me about him." Henderson glanced around the empty store as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned across the counter and lowered his voice. "Jake's got a spread about 10 miles north of here. Raises cattle, or claims to. But there's been talk about his operation, if you know what I mean. Some folks say he's got interests that go beyond legitimate ranching." "What kind of interests?" Charles demanded, his voice rising with anxiety. "Boy, there are some questions it's not healthy to ask in this territory," Henderson replied, but his eyes conveyed more information than his words. "Let's just say Jake Morrison has been spending a lot more money than cattle ranching typically provides. And he's been hiring men who don't look like cowboys." Outside the general store, Haloki immediately began searching for the continuation of Ginger's tracks, his experienced eyes scanning the hard-packed earth of the main street for signs of the mare's distinctive gait. The task was complicated by the numerous other horses, wagons, and foot traffic that had churned the ground into a confusing maze of overlapping impressions. "There," he said finally, pointing to a spot near the town's water trough where the softer ground had preserved clearer prints. "Your mother watered her horse here before leaving town. These tracks show the mare was still calm, still walking at a steady pace. The trail led north from Cedar Ridge, following a well-traveled wagon road that curved around a series of low hills before disappearing into the heat shimmer of the desert horizon. Haloki set a pace that the children could maintain while keeping his senses alert for any signs that the tracks they followed had deviated from the main road. For the first several miles, Ginger's hoofprints remained clearly visible among the wagon ruts. indicating that Elizabeth had indeed been heading home, as she'd told Henderson. But as they crested a rise that offered a commanding view of the surrounding landscape, Haloki suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. "What is it?" Charles whispered, automatically scanning the empty terrain for signs of danger. Haloki knelt beside the road, studying the ground with intense concentration. When he looked up, his expression had grown grim. Here the tracks change. The mare's gait becomes irregular, nervous. And there are other hoofprints joining the trail. 3 horses, all shod, carrying heavy riders moving at speed. Abigail clutched her doll tighter, her young mind struggling to process the implications of what Haloki was describing. "Does that mean someone was chasing Mama? Or herding her?" Haloki replied, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated experience with such situations. "The pattern suggests your mother was forced to leave the main road. Her horse was frightened, trying to resist, but the other riders gave her no choice. The side trail that branched off from the main road was barely visible, little more than a game path that wound between stands of mesquite and palo verde trees. But to Haloki's trained eyes, it told a clear story of horses moving in formation, with Ginger being driven ahead of the other 3 mounts like a sheep being herded by wolves. The trail led them through increasingly rough terrain, over rocky ground that would have challenged even an experienced rider, through arroyos that could become death traps during flash floods, and across stretches of desert so barren that even the hardy vegetation of the region struggled to survive. It was country that seemed designed to swallow travelers without trace, where a person could disappear as completely as if they had never existed. After several hours of difficult tracking, Haloki led them to a sheltered spot among a cluster of large boulders where the signs of recent human habitation were unmistakable. The remains of a campfire, still cold but not more than a day old, marked the center of an area where multiple horses had been tethered and men had made themselves comfortable for an extended stay. "They waited here," Haloki announced, examining the scattered evidence with methodical thoroughness. 4 men, probably longer than they expected. These cigarette butts are from different brands, suggesting different smokers. The depth of the horse tracks indicates they were carrying supplies for several days. Charles kicked angrily at the cold ashes of the fire. They planned this. They knew Mama would be coming this way, and they set a trap for her. Perhaps, Haloki agreed, though his tone suggested he was considering other possibilities. Or perhaps they were waiting for any traveler who might prove profitable. Lone women are particularly vulnerable to men who make their living through violence and theft. Abigail had wandered to the edge of the camp area, where something caught her attention among the rocks. "Charles, come look at this." What she had found made Haloki's blood run cold with rage, and the children cry out in fear and recognition. Caught on a sharp stone and fluttering in the desert breeze was a piece of blue fabric, torn from what had obviously been a woman's dress. The fabric matched perfectly the dress Elizabeth Carter had been wearing when she left home the previous morning. "Mama," Abigail whispered, reaching for the scrap of cloth with trembling fingers. Haloki gently intercepted her hand, preventing her from disturbing what might be crucial evidence. "Do not touch it yet. Let me read what this place has to tell us." His examination of the surrounding area revealed a story that filled him with cold fury. Signs of a struggle, deep gouges in the earth where someone had been dragged, and most telling of all, drops of blood on the rocks that had dried to a dark brown color in the desert heat. And "She fought them," Haloki announced with grim admiration. "Your mother did not surrender easily. The blood trail suggests she was injured, but not seriously. They bound her and took her from this place on horseback." Charles's hands clenched into fists, his young face twisted with rage and helplessness. "Where did they take her? Can you follow the trail?" "Yes," Haloki replied, his voice carrying the promise of vengeance. "The tracks lead deeper into the Badlands, toward country where outlaws and renegades make their camps. But Charles, Abigail, you must understand that what we may find will not be pleasant. Men who kidnap women for profit rarely treat their captives with kindness. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the desert landscape, Haloki faced a decision that would determine not only the success of their mission, but potentially the survival of the two children who had entrusted their lives to his care. The trail they were following led into some of the most dangerous territory in the entire region. A landscape of hidden canyons and secret valleys where outlaws, renegades, and worse made their homes. It was country where even experienced Apache warriors traveled with extreme caution, where a single mistake could result in death or capture by men who viewed human life as just another commodity to be bought and sold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trail grows cold as we wait, Halok observed, though his eyes conveyed his internal struggle. Every hour that passes makes it more difficult to follow. Gives your mother's captors more time to reach whatever destination they have chosen. Then we keep going, Charles declared, with the stubborn determination that Haloki had come to expect from the boy. We don't stop until we find her. The country ahead is no place for children, Haloki warned. There are men in those canyons who would kill you for your shoes, who would sell your sister to traders who specialize in human cargo. If we continue, there may be no turning back. Abigail stepped forward, her small chin raised defiantly despite the fear that was clearly visible in her eyes. Mama would never give up on us. We're not giving up on her. Looking at these two children, so young and yet already hardened by the brutal realities of frontier life, Haloki felt the last of his reservations crumble. In their determination, he saw echoes of his own lost family, remembered the desperate love that had driven him to fight impossible odds in futile attempts to protect those he cherished most. Then we go forward, he announced, shouldering his pack and checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. But from this point, we travel as Apache warriors travel, silent and invisible, ready for war at any moment. The men who took your mother will learn what happens when they prey upon the innocent in Apache hunting grounds. As they prepared to leave the abandoned camp and follow the trail deeper into the lawless territory ahead, Haloki offered a silent prayer to the spirits of his ancestors, asking for the strength and wisdom to bring justice to Elizabeth Carter and safety to her children. The hunt that had begun as a search for a missing woman was transforming into something far more dangerous. A war between the forces of civilization and the predators who lurked in the shadows of the frontier. The desert wind picked up as they resumed their pursuit, carrying with it the scent of distant storms and the promise of violence to come. Somewhere ahead, in country where maps meant nothing and law was whatever strong men chose to make it, Elizabeth Carter waited for rescue while her captors made plans that would determine whether this story ended in reunion or tragedy. Behind them, the abandoned camp slowly surrendered its secrets to the desert wind, the torn fabric finally breaking free to dance across the wasteland like a blue ghost seeking justice for crimes committed in the merciless vastness of the American frontier. The Badlands opened before them like the mouth of some ancient beast, a maze of twisted canyons and wind-carved rock formations that seemed designed by nature to hide the worst of humanity from the eyes of civilization. Here, in this forsaken wilderness where even the Apache rarely ventured, the normal rules of society crumbled like sand in a desert storm, replaced by the brutal law of whoever possessed the most guns and the least conscience. Haloki moved with the fluid grace of a shadow-given form, his moccasined feet finding purchase on surfaces that would have sent lesser trackers tumbling into hidden ravines. Behind him, Charles and Abigail struggled to match his pace, their breathing labored from the constant climb through increasingly treacherous terrain. The trail they followed had grown fainter as it led over solid rock, but Haloki's experienced eyes could still read the subtle signs that marked their quarry's passage. A displaced pebble here, a scratch on sandstone there, the faint scent of horse sweat carried on vagrant breezes. The men we follow know this country well, Halok observed. pausing at a fork in the canyon where two passages branched in different directions. They chose their route to confuse pursuers, to make tracking as difficult as possible. But they made one mistake. Charles wiped sweat from his forehead with a sleeve already soaked from the desert heat. What mistake? They assume their pursuers think like white men, Haloki replied, kneeling to examine what appeared to be empty stone. White trackers follow hoofprints and broken branches. Apache trackers follow the spirit of the hunted. He placed his hand flat against the canyon wall, closing his eyes and seeming to listen to something only he could hear. When he opened them again, his expression had grown more determined. Your mother passed this way less than 18 hours ago. She was conscious, aware enough to leave a sign for those who might follow. Abigail pressed closer, her young eyes scanning the rock face desperately. What sign? I don't see anything. Haloki pointed to what looked like a random scratch in the sandstone, barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look. 3 lines carved with something metal. Your mother still had her father's ring, the one with the sharp edge you told me about. She scratched these marks while her captors were not watching. The discovery filled Charles with both hope and terror. Hope because it meant their mother had been alive and thinking clearly enough to leave clues for rescue. Terror because it confirmed she was indeed in the hands of men who had dragged her deep into outlaw country for purposes that didn't bear thinking about. The trail led them through a natural gateway formed by 2 massive stone pillars that rose from the canyon floor like the columns of some prehistoric temple. Beyond this portal, the landscape opened into a hidden valley that seemed to exist in defiance of the surrounding desert, fed by underground springs that supported stands of cottonwood trees and patches of green grass that looked almost miraculous in this land of endless brown and red. But this oasis harbored secrets darker than its beauty suggested. As they crested a ridge that overlooked the valley floor, Haloki suddenly dropped flat against the rocks and motioned urgently for the children to do the same. Below them, partially concealed among the trees, lay what could only be described as an outlaw camp, a collection of rough shelters, corrals for stolen horses, and the scattered debris of men who lived outside the law. Stay down and stay silent, Haloki whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. We have found the place where your mother was brought, but we are not alone in this valley. Through gaps in the vegetation, they could see movement among the buildings. Men with rifles slung across their shoulders, horses bearing brands that had been deliberately obscured, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be cages constructed from wagon parts and iron bars. The purpose of such structures in an outlaw camp was too horrible for Charles to contemplate, but Haloki's grim expression suggested he understood their significance all too well. How many men? Charles whispered, though part of him dreaded the answer. Haloki spent several minutes studying the camp with the intensity of a military scout planning an assault. 12, maybe 15. All armed, all experienced in violence. This is not a temporary hideout, but a permanent base of operations. These men have been preying on travelers for months, perhaps years. Abigail's small hand found Charles's arm, her grip tight with fear. Is Mama down there? Can you see her? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying with it all the hope and terror that had driven them across miles of brutal terrain. Haloki continued his surveillance, his Apache-trained eyes cataloguing every detail of the camp below, searching for any sign of their missing woman among the shadows and buildings. There, he said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion. The largest building, the one with iron bars over the windows. I can see movement inside, but I cannot determine if it is your mother or someone else. What followed was the most agonizing hour of Charles's young life, lying motionless on the rocky ridge while Haloki conducted a thorough reconnaissance of the outlaw stronghold. The Apache warrior seemed to become one with the landscape itself, moving position by position around the valley's rim with such stealth that even the children watching him sometimes lost sight of his location. From each vantage point, Haloki gathered intelligence about the camp's defenses, the routines of its inhabitants, and most importantly, the layout of the building where captives were likely being held. What he discovered painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal operation that went far beyond simple highway robbery. The outlaws had established what amounted to a slave trading post in the hidden valley, a place where kidnapped travelers were held until they could be sold to buyers who operated even further beyond the reach of territorial law. The cages Charles had spotted were designed to hold multiple prisoners, suggesting that Elizabeth Carter was not the first victim to be brought to this forsaken place. When Haloki finally returned to where the children waited, his face bore an expression of barely controlled rage that made him look more like the fearsome Apache warrior of frontier legends than the gentle tracker who had befriended two lost children. "Your mother is alive," he announced without preamble. "I saw her through the barred window. She appears injured but conscious." The relief that flooded through Charles was so intense it left him momentarily dizzy. "We have to get her out of there. We have to rescue her right now." "Patience," Haloki counseled, though his own desire for immediate action was clearly visible in his clenched jaw. A frontal assault would be suicide. 15 armed men against one warrior and 2 children are impossible odds, even for Apache tactics. Abigail's voice came out small and frightened. "Then how do we save Mama? We can't just leave her in that terrible place." Halok studied the camp below with the calculating mind of a warrior who had survived countless battles through careful planning rather than reckless courage. "We wait for darkness. We study their patterns. And we use the one advantage we possess that they do not expect." "What advantage?" Charles asked. "They are watching for pursuit from the direction of Cedar Ridge, from territorial marshals or cavalry patrols that might follow the official roads. They are not prepared for an attack from the desert itself, from the ancient hunting grounds of a people they believe they have conquered." As the afternoon wore on, the hidden valley below became a stage where the drama of outlaw life played out in scenes both mundane and terrifying. The children watched men cleaning weapons, tending stolen horses, and conducting what appeared to be business negotiations over goods that were certainly not obtained through legal means. Most disturbing were the periodic checks made on the prison building where Elizabeth was being held. Every few hours, one of the outlaws would unlock the heavy door and disappear inside for several minutes before emerging again. The purpose of these visits was left to the imagination, but Haloki's increasingly dark expression suggested he had a clear understanding of what they likely entailed. "They are preparing her for transport," he explained grimly, when Charles pressed him for details. "This camp is not a final destination but a way station. Your mother will be moved again soon, probably to buyers who operate even deeper in the wilderness." The implications of this revelation hit Charles like a physical blow. "How long do we have?" "Difficult to say. Perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow, but not long. Once she's moved from here, tracking becomes much more difficult, perhaps impossible." As shadows began to lengthen across the valley floor, signaling the approach of the desert twilight that would provide cover for their rescue attempt, Haloki began sharing the details of the plan that had been forming in his mind throughout the long hours of observation. The outlaw camp's greatest strength was also its primary weakness. Confident in their isolation and the natural barriers that protected their valley, the men below had grown careless about perimeter security. They posted guards, but those guards were watching the main approaches rather than the cliff faces that any rational person would consider impossible to descend. Apache warriors learned to move through country that white men consider impassable, Haloki explained as he checked his weapons and prepared the specialized equipment he would need for the descent. "What they see as impossible, we see as merely difficult." The strategy Haloki outlined was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Under cover of darkness, he would descend the cliff face that overlooked the prison building, moving like a ghost through terrain that the outlaws had dismissed as unclimbable. Once inside the camp, he would neutralize the guards silently and extract Elizabeth Carter before the alarm could be raised. "What about us?" Charles demanded. "We're not just going to sit here while you risk your life for our mother. You will serve as lookouts and provide early warning if additional riders approach the valley, Haloki replied. Your job is to watch the main trail and signal me if rescue turns into retreat. It was a role that Charles chafed against, his young mind burning with the desire to participate directly in his mother's rescue. But even his inexperience could recognize the wisdom in Haloki's plan. 2 children stumbling around in the darkness would be more liability than asset in a mission that required absolute stealth and precision. As full darkness settled over the hidden valley like a protective blanket, Haloki began his transformation from tracker to warrior. He stripped away everything unnecessary, retaining only his knife, a coil of rope, and a small pouch of items whose purpose Charles could only guess at. His movements became more fluid, more predatory, as if the approaching violence had awakened something primal in his Apache soul. If I do not return by dawn, he instructed the children with the matter-of-fact tone of a man discussing routine business, follow the main trail back towards Cedar Ridge. Find the territorial marshal and tell him what you have discovered here. Do not attempt any foolish rescue missions. Abigail threw her small arms around Haloki's waist, tears streaming down her face. Please bring Mama back. Please don't let those bad men hurt her anymore. The Apache warrior's stern expression softened as he looked down at the frightened little girl. For a moment his weathered features showed not the face of a legendary tracker, but that of a man who remembered what it felt like to have children of his own, depending on his strength and courage. I will bring her back, he promised, and in those 4 words lay all the determination and skill that had made his name whispered with respect and fear across the entire territory. What followed was a display of physical skill and courage that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. Moving with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill, Haloki began his descent of a cliff face that would have challenged an experienced mountaineer with proper equipment. Using cracks in the rock for handholds and finding footing on ledges barely wide enough for his moccasined feet, he descended toward the outlaw camp like a spirit of vengeance given physical form. Charles and Abigail watched from above, their hearts hammering with fear and admiration as the Apache warrior disappeared and reappeared among the shadows of the rock face. Several times he seemed to simply vanish, becoming so perfectly camouflaged against the stone that even knowing where to look, they could not spot his location. The descent took nearly an hour, with Haloki pausing frequently to assess his route and ensure that his movements had not attracted attention from the guards below. When he finally reached the valley floor, he seemed to melt into the landscape like morning mist, becoming just another shadow among the many that danced in the moonlight. From their perch high above, the children could see the outlaw camp spread out like a miniature village, complete with the warm glow of campfires and the occasional movement of guards making their rounds. Somewhere in that collection of rough buildings, their mother waited for rescue, probably not daring to hope that help was mere yards away. The next phase of Haloki's plan would test not only his combat skills, but his ability to move through hostile territory without alerting men whose survival depended on their ability to detect threats before those threats could materialize into violence. One mistake, one careless step or inadvertent sound would transform a rescue mission into a battle that could only end in death for both rescuer and victim. As clouds drifted across the moon, plunging the valley into even deeper darkness, Haloki began his approach to the prison building, where Elizabeth Carter waited for either salvation or a fate too terrible to contemplate. Behind him, the cliff face rose like a wall separating civilization from chaos, while ahead lay the greatest test of skills that had been honed through decades of warfare on the unforgiving frontier. The hunt for Elizabeth Carter was about to reach its most dangerous phase, where success would mean reunion and failure would mean death for everyone who had dared to challenge the brutal law of the outlaw territory. Haloki moved through the outlaw camp like death itself, silent and inevitable, his moccasined feet finding the spaces between scattered equipment and sleeping forms with the precision of a predator who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of unseen movement. The guards, confident in their isolation and the natural barriers that protected their valley, had grown complacent, their attention focused outward toward the main approaches rather than inward toward the shadows that danced among their own buildings. The prison structure stood apart from the other buildings, constructed with heavy timber and reinforced with iron bars that spoke of experience in containing unwilling captives. A single guard sat on a wooden crate beside the door, his rifle across his knees, his head nodding with the rhythm of a man fighting sleep after too many hours of tedious duty. From his position in the shadows of a nearby corral, Haloki studied the guard's patterns with the patience of a hunter who understood that haste led to mistakes and mistakes led to death. Every few minutes, the man would shift position, stretch his legs, or take a drink from a bottle that explained his increasing drowsiness. The Apache warrior timed these movements with the precision of a clockmaker, calculating the exact moment when opportunity would present itself. When that moment came, Haloki struck with the fluid efficiency of lightning finding ground. One moment the guard was reaching for his bottle, and the next he was unconscious. Haloki's arm, having applied pressure to precisely the right spot on his neck to induce instant unconsciousness without permanent harm. The Apache had learned long ago that unnecessary killing often created more problems than it solved. The lock on the prison door was crude but effective, designed more for strength than sophistication. Haloki produced a set of tools from his pouch that would have surprised those who thought of Apache warriors as simple savages. Picks and tension wrenches crafted from salvaged metal and bone. Tools that reflected both necessity and ingenuity, born from years of operating in a world where locked doors often stood between survival and death. The lock surrendered after several tense minutes of careful manipulation, the tumblers finally aligning with a soft click that seemed as loud as gunfire in the desert silence. Haloki eased the door open just wide enough to slip inside, his hand instinctively moving to his knife as he prepared for whatever horrors might await within. What he found inside the prison building challenged even his experienced understanding of human cruelty. The structure was divided into several cells, each barely large enough for a person to lie down, with iron bars that had been salvaged from some long-abandoned territorial jail. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, fear, and the particular stench of despair that seemed to cling to places where hope had been systematically destroyed. Elizabeth Carter occupied the cell farthest from the door, but she was not alone in this hell. 3 other captives shared the prison, a Mexican woman whose eyes held the hollow look of someone who had given up expecting rescue, an elderly man whose expensive clothes suggested he had been targeted for ransom rather than sale, and most disturbing of all, a young woman who could not have been more than 16 years old. Elizabeth looked up as Haloki appeared in the doorway like a figure from her most desperate prayers. Her face bore the evidence of rough treatment, a bruised cheek, split lip, and the kind of haunted expression that came from experiencing the absolute worst of human nature. But her eyes still held the fire of a mother who had not surrendered hope of seeing her children again. "Are you real?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of crying and shouting for help that never came. "I am Haloki," he replied quietly, already working on the lock of her cell with tools that seemed impossibly delicate in his large hands. "Your children sent me to bring you home." The mention of Charles and Abigail broke through Elizabeth's careful emotional control, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her desperate hope had somehow materialized into actual rescue. "My babies, are they safe?" "Please tell me they're safe. They wait on the ridge above, counting the minutes until their mother returns," Haloki assured her as the cell lock yielded to his manipulation. "But we must move quickly and quietly. The entire camp sleeps lightly, and discovery means death for all of us." Elizabeth stood on unsteady legs, her body bearing the evidence of the rough handling she had endured since her capture. But her spirit remained unbroken, and when she saw the other captives watching with desperate hope, she grabbed Halok's arm with surprising strength. "We can't leave them," she insisted, her voice carrying the moral conviction that had always defined her character. "I won't save myself by abandoning others to this hell." Haloki faced a decision that would have challenged even the most experienced military commander. His original plan had accounted for extracting one person under cover of darkness, a difficult but manageable task for someone with his skills. Attempting to rescue 4 captives would multiply the risks exponentially, turning a stealth mission into something approaching an assault on a fortified position. But looking into Elizabeth's eyes, seeing the absolute determination to do what was right, regardless of personal cost, Haloki recognized something that reminded him of why he had once been proud to call himself a warrior. True strength was not measured by the ability to destroy enemies, but by the willingness to protect innocence, even when such protection demanded terrible sacrifice. "Then we take them all," he decided, though his practical mind was already calculating the nightmare logistics of moving 4 weakened captives through hostile territory while pursued by 15 armed outlaws. "But you must understand that this choice may cost us everything." "Some things are worth more than safety," Elizabeth replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "My children will grow up knowing their mother stood for something, or they won't grow up with a mother at all." The other captives stirred to life as Haloki began working on their cell locks, hope flickering in eyes that had grown accustomed to despair. The Mexican woman, who introduced herself as Carmen Vasquez, had been held for over a month after being taken from a wagon train. The elderly man, Samuel Thornton, was a territorial judge whose capture had been planned specifically to extract information about upcoming trials of captured outlaws. Most heartbreaking was the young woman, Rebecca Mills, who had been traveling to meet her fiancé in California when her stagecoach had been attacked. She had been held in this place for 3 weeks, and the haunted look in her eyes suggested experiences that would leave scars long after physical wounds healed. "Can you all walk?" Haloki asked as he freed the last lock. "The path to safety is treacherous, and we cannot carry anyone who cannot keep pace." Each captive nodded with the grim determination of people who understood that this might be their only chance at freedom. Even Rebecca, despite her obvious trauma, straightened her shoulders and prepared to face whatever hardships lay ahead, rather than spend another day in outlaw captivity. Leading 4 weakened captives through a hostile camp required skills that went beyond even Haloki's considerable abilities. The Apache warrior found himself calling upon not just his training in stealth and combat, but his understanding of human psychology, how to move people who were terrified, weakened, and unfamiliar with the techniques needed for silent movement through dangerous territory. The first challenge came immediately as they left the prison building. The unconscious guard was beginning to stir, and his groans threatened to alert the entire camp to their escape attempt. Haloki quickly bound and gagged the man, buying them precious minutes before the alarm would inevitably be raised. Moving in single file, with Elizabeth directly behind Haloki and the other captives following in order of their physical condition, the small group began making their way toward the edge of the camp. Every shadow might conceal a guard. Every sound might trigger a response that would transform rescue into slaughter. They had covered perhaps 50 yards when disaster struck in the form of a drunk outlaw stumbling from the latrine directly into their path. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the man stared at the escaping captives with the confused expression of someone whose alcohol-fogged brain was struggling to process an impossible sight. Haloki moved with the speed of striking lightning, but he was not quite fast enough to prevent the outlaw from drawing breath for a shout that would wake the entire camp. The Apache's hand clamped over the man's mouth just as the first syllable emerged, but the brief sound was enough to alert other guards who were beginning to investigate the disturbance. What followed was a running battle through the outlaw camp as Haloki fought to protect 4 civilians while conducting a fighting withdrawal toward the cliff face that represented their only hope of escape. The Apache warrior's rifle spoke with deadly accuracy, dropping 2 outlaws who emerged from their shelters in response to the alarm, while his tactical mind calculated distances, cover positions, and the rapidly diminishing chances of reaching safety. Elizabeth surprised everyone, including herself, by proving remarkably capable under fire. Drawing upon reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed, she helped shepherd the other captives toward the cliff, while Haloki provided covering fire. Her experience as a frontier woman had taught her to function under pressure, and she applied those lessons now with life-or-death intensity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The rope! Haloki shouted over the sound of gunfire as they reached the base of the cliff face. I left climbing gear hidden among those rocks. Find it while I hold them off. The rope and climbing equipment that Haloki had cached represented their lifeline to safety, but retrieving it while under fire required courage that went beyond normal human limits. Carmen Vasquez, the Mexican woman who had seemed broken by her captivity, suddenly revealed the steel core that had enabled her to survive weeks of outlaw brutality. Ignoring the bullets that whined overhead, she located Haloki's equipment and began organizing the escape route with the efficiency of someone who had grown up in mountain country. Within minutes, she had the rope anchored and was helping the other captives begin their ascent, while Haloki continued his desperate rearguard action. As Rebecca Mills began her climb up the cliff face, her movement dislodged a small object that fell to the ground with a metallic clink. In the chaotic light of muzzle flashes and torch flames, the object seemed insignificant, just another piece of debris in a landscape littered with the remnants of outlaw life. But Elizabeth Carter's eyes fell upon the object, and her blood turned to ice as she recognized what had fallen from Rebecca's clothing. It was a distinctive silver locket, engraved with initials that Elizabeth knew as well as her own name. The locket had belonged to her sister Martha, who had supposedly died of cholera in Kansas 3 years earlier. "Where did you get this?" Elizabeth demanded, grabbing Rebecca's arm with desperate intensity. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the locket that had been her most precious possession. "It was my mother's, the only thing I had left of her after she died. The outlaws took it from me when I was captured." The implications hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Martha had not died of cholera in Kansas. She had somehow made her way west, had married and started a new life, had given birth to this young woman who bore an unmistakable family resemblance once Elizabeth knew what to look for. "Martha was your mother?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Martha Carter, who married a man named Mills?" Rebecca's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. "How could you possibly know that?" "Mama never talked about her family back east, said it was too painful." "Because Martha Carter was my sister," Elizabeth replied, tears streaming down her face as she realized that fate had brought her not just to freedom, but to the discovery of family she had thought lost forever. "Rebecca, you're my niece." "Your family." The emotional reunion would have to wait for safety, as Haloki's ammunition was running low and the outlaws were beginning to organize a more coordinated assault on their position. One by one, the captives ascended the cliff face using techniques that Haloki had learned from a lifetime of moving through impossible terrain. Carmen Vasquez proved surprisingly adept at rock climbing, her mountain upbringing serving her well as she helped guide the others up the treacherous route. Judge Thornton, despite his age, climbed with the determination of a man who understood that failure meant not just death, but the loss of crucial information about outlaw operations that could save other lives. Elizabeth and Rebecca climbed side by side, their newly discovered family bond giving them strength to overcome exhaustion and fear. The revelation that they were aunt and niece had transformed their escape from a rescue mission into a family reunion that neither had dared hope for. Haloki came last, his warrior's code demanding that he ensure the safety of others before seeking his own. As he began his ascent, the outlaws below were finally organizing torches and lanterns that would allow them to target the climbing figures. Bullets began striking the rock face around the Apache warrior, sending stone fragments flying like shrapnel. But Haloki climbed with the fluid grace of someone who had learned such skills as a child, treating the vertical cliff face like a ladder designed specifically for his use. His hands found holes that others might have missed. His feet located ledges that seemed impossibly narrow, and his warrior's instincts guided him up the face faster than his pursuers could follow with their lights. Matitsadil. Charles and Abigail heard the gunfire echoing from the valley below and watched in terror as muzzle flashes lit up the outlaw camp like deadly fireworks. When figures began emerging at the top of the cliff face, the children rushed forward with hearts hammering between hope and fear. The first face to appear belonged to Carmen Vasquez, followed quickly by Judge Thornton, and then by two figures climbing together who looked like they might be Mama. Abigail shrieked, launching herself toward Elizabeth Carter with the desperate love of a child who had nearly lost everything. Charles followed more slowly, his 12-year-old dignity warring with relief so intense it left him shaking. The reunion was everything Elizabeth had dreamed of during her captivity, her children's arms around her, their tears mixing with hers, the knowledge that her family was whole again, despite the nightmare they had endured. But the presence of the other rescued captives, particularly Rebecca, meant that this escape had revealed connections and possibilities that none of them had imagined. "Children," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion, "I want you to meet your cousin Rebecca. She's Aunt Martha's daughter. The implications of this revelation would take time to fully process, but for now it was enough that they were all alive, all free, and climbing toward a dawn that promised new beginnings rather than the continuation of nightmare. Behind them, the outlaw camp burned with the fires of justice, while ahead lay the long journey home and the chance to build something better from the ashes of what they had almost lost. Haloki emerged last from the cliff face, his clothing torn and bloodied, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished against impossible odds. Looking at the group of survivors he had helped rescue, seeing the family connections that had been revealed through their shared ordeal, he felt something he had not experienced since losing his own family, the sense that he had helped create something meaningful from the chaos and violence of frontier life. The dawn that broke over the Badlands carried with it the ominous sound of pursuit, the thunder of hoofbeats echoing off canyon walls as Jake Morrison led a dozen heavily armed outlaws in relentless pursuit of the escaped captives. What Haloki had hoped would be a clean extraction had become a running battle across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the entire territory, with the lives of 6 people hanging in the balance against impossible odds. From their position on a windswept mesa that offered commanding views of the surrounding country, the group could see dust clouds rising from multiple directions as Morrison's men spread out to cut off every possible escape route. The outlaw leader had awakened to find his most valuable captives gone and his reputation in ruins, circumstances that demanded violent retribution if he hoped to maintain control over his criminal empire. "They're not just chasing us," Judge Thornton observed grimly, his legal mind analyzing the tactical situation with the cold precision of someone who had spent years studying criminal behavior. "Morrison's dividing his forces to drive us toward a specific location, probably an ambush site where he can end this pursuit on his terms." Haloki studied the distant riders through eyes that had learned to read the intentions of enemies across miles of empty landscape. The Apache warrior's expression grew increasingly grim as he calculated the mathematics of their situation. 6 people, only 2 of whom were armed and experienced in combat, against a dozen professional killers who knew this territory as well as he did. "The canyon ahead," he announced, pointing toward a narrow passage that cut through a massive rock formation. "Morrison is herding us toward Devil's Throat Canyon. It's a natural trap with only one way in and one way out. If we enter that passage, we won't emerge alive." Elizabeth felt her newly recovered hope begin to crumble as she realized that escaping the outlaw camp had been only the beginning of their ordeal. "Then what do? We can't outrun mounted men on foot, and we can't fight them in open ground." Charles, who had been unusually quiet since the reunion with his mother, suddenly spoke up with the kind of insight that sometimes came from minds not yet constrained by adult assumptions about what was possible. "What if we don't run anymore? What if we make them come to us on ground we choose?" The formation Charles had spotted rose from the desert floor like a natural fortress, its sheer walls accessible only through a narrow chimney that would force attackers to approach single file while defenders commanded the high ground. It was the kind of defensive position that Apache warriors had used for centuries to hold off superior numbers, turning the landscape itself into an ally against overwhelming odds. Haloke examined the boy's suggestion with the respect due to tactical insight, regardless of its source. "The mesa would provide excellent defensive advantages," he admitted, "but it would also trap us. Once Morrison's men surround the base, we become prisoners on our own fortress. Better prisoners with fighting positions than corpses in an ambush," Rebecca said, with a steel in her voice that surprised everyone, including herself. The traumatized young woman who had been rescued from outlaw captivity was beginning to show the backbone that had enabled her to survive weeks of brutality without breaking completely. Carmen Vasquez, who had remained largely silent since their escape, suddenly revealed knowledge that changed the entire tactical equation. "There is another way off that mesa," she announced, her Mexican accent thickening with excitement. "My people have used this country for generations. That formation has caves, passages that connect to springs, and eventually to canyons miles from here. The revelation that their potential fortress might also serve as an escape route transformed desperation into opportunity. If they could reach the mesa, establish defensive positions, and locate the hidden passages that Carmen described, they might yet turn Morrison's pursuit into a trap for the pursuers themselves. "The climb will be difficult," Haloke warned as they began making their way toward the towering rock formation. "Anyone who falls will not survive, and anyone who cannot keep pace will be left behind." Elizabeth looked at the two children who had already endured more hardship than most adults faced in a lifetime. Then at Rebecca and the other survivors who were drawing on reserves of courage they hadn't known they possessed. "We've come this far together. We'll reach the top together or not at all." The climb up the chimney passage began as a test of physical endurance and quickly became a race against death as Morrison's advance riders arrived at the base of the mesa just as the last members of their group were beginning the ascent. Rifle fire echoed off the canyon walls as bullets struck rock face mere inches from climbing figures, sending stone fragments flying like deadly confetti. Haloke, bringing up the rear with Judge Thornton, returned fire with methodical precision that spoke of years spent in similar life-or-death situations. Each shot from his rifle found its mark, dropping outlaws who exposed themselves while trying to find shooting angles on the climbing fugitives. But his ammunition was limited, and Morrison's men seemed to have an endless supply of bullets and the tactical patience to use them effectively. "Keep climbing!" he shouted over the sound of gunfire. "Don't look down, don't think about the bullets. Just focus on the next handhold." Carmen proved invaluable during the ascent, her intimate knowledge of the rock formation allowing her to guide the others toward the safest route, while avoiding sections where loose stone might give way under their weight. She climbed with the fluid grace of someone who had grown up in mountain country, seemingly unbothered by the prospect of a fall that would mean certain death. Charles surprised everyone with his climbing ability, his young body adapting quickly to the demands of vertical movement, while his protective instincts kept him positioned to help Abigail whenever she struggled with particularly difficult sections. The boy was transforming before their eyes from frightened child to capable young man, shaped by circumstances that would have broken many adults. Abigail, despite her age and small size, climbed with the determination of someone who had already faced her worst fears and discovered that courage was not the absence of terror, but the decision to continue, despite it. Her corn-husk doll remained clutched in one hand throughout the ascent, a tangible connection to the innocence she was rapidly leaving behind. The top of the mesa revealed itself to be a natural fortress, even more formidable than it had appeared from below, with scattered boulders providing cover for defensive positions, while scattered caves offered both shelter and potential escape routes. Most importantly, the summit commanded views in every direction, making it impossible for attackers to approach without being seen long before they posed a threat. Morrison's voice echoed from the base of the mesa, magnified by the canyon walls, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You can't stay up there forever," the outlaw leader shouted. "No food, no water, nowhere to go. Come down now and maybe some of you live through this." Judge Thornton, whose legal experience had taught him to recognize the psychology of criminals, cupped his hands and shouted back with surprising authority. "Jake Morrison, you're already facing charges for kidnapping, murder, and operating a criminal enterprise. Surrender now, and you might avoid the hangman's noose." The outlaw's laughter carried a note of genuine amusement. "You think territorial law reaches into these canyons, Judge? You think badges and warrants mean anything out here? I am the law in this country, and my justice is about to be delivered with hot lead." Elizabeth found herself thinking about the children who depended on her survival, about the family connections that had been revealed through their shared ordeal, about the life she wanted to build from the ashes of this nightmare. "How long can we hold them off?" she asked Haloki quietly. "As long as our ammunition lasts," the Apache replied grimly. "After that, we fight with rocks and knives until we cannot fight anymore. But there may be another option." Carmen's exploration of the cave system revealed more than just potential escape routes. She discovered evidence that this mesa had been used as a hideout by other groups, including what appeared to be a cache of weapons and supplies left by previous occupants. More intriguingly, she found signs that the caves were currently being used by someone else, someone who had taken great care to conceal their presence from casual observation. The mystery was solved when a voice spoke from the shadows of the deepest cave, a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. Well, looks like Jake Morrison finally picked the wrong people to cross. The figure who emerged from the darkness was a woman in her 40s, dressed in practical frontier clothing and armed with weapons that showed signs of regular use. Her weathered face bore scars that spoke of violent encounters survived through skill and determination, while her eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and refused to be broken by it. "Captain Sarah Mitchell," she introduced herself, extending a hand that bore calluses from years of hard living. Former cavalry, current fugitive from Morrison's particular brand of frontier justice. The revelation that they were not alone on the mesa changed everything about their tactical situation. Captain Mitchell commanded a small group of former soldiers and civilian volunteers who had been waging a guerrilla campaign against Morrison's criminal empire for months, using the mesa's cave system as their base of operations. "Morrison killed my husband and son when they refused to pay his protection fees," Mitchell explained, as she led them deeper into the cave complex. "Since then, I've been making his life as difficult as possible. Your escape from his camp has given me the opportunity I've been waiting for." The caves proved to be far more extensive than anyone had imagined, with passages that connected to underground streams and eventually emerged in canyons miles from the mesa. More importantly, they contained an arsenal of weapons and supplies that Mitchell's group had accumulated through months of raids on outlaw camps and supply lines. What emerged from the meeting between Haloki, Captain Mitchell, and the other survivors was a plan audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rather than simply escaping through the cave system, they would use Morrison's siege of the Mesa as an opportunity to destroy his entire operation, striking simultaneously at his forces below, while other members of Mitchell's group attacked the outlaw base camp that had been left lightly defended. Morrison brought most of his men with him, Mitchell explained as she spread hand-drawn maps across the cave floor. That leaves maybe 4 or 5 guards at the main camp, probably drunk and overconfident. A small force could take the place and free any other captives while we deal with Morrison's assault force here. The plan required splitting their already small group, with some remaining to defend the Mesa, while others made the dangerous journey through the cave system to attack the outlaw camp. It was a strategy that multiplied their risks while offering the possibility of ending Morrison's reign of terror permanently rather than simply postponing the next encounter. Elizabeth found herself facing a choice that went to the heart of everything she believed about right and wrong. They could escape safely through the caves, taking their rescued family and disappearing into the vast wilderness where Morrison would never find them. Or they could stand and fight, risking everything for the chance to ensure that other families would never face the nightmare they had endured. "I've spent 3 years thinking my sister was dead," she said finally, looking at Rebecca with eyes that held both love and determination. "I won't spend the rest of my life knowing that other families are being destroyed while I do nothing to stop it." Charles and Abigail listened to the adults planning what amounted to a small war with the wide-eyed fascination of children discovering that their mother possessed depths of courage they had never imagined. The woman who had tucked them into bed and worried about winter boots was discussing tactics and ammunition counts with the matter-of-fact tone of an experienced soldier. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the mesa, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the escaped captives, but the future of criminal operations throughout the territory. Morrison's men had surrounded the base of the mesa and were constructing defensive positions that suggested they intended to wait out their quarry rather than risk the casualties that would come from a direct assault. But Morrison had not counted on the cave system that honeycombed the mesa, nor on the presence of Captain Mitchell's guerrilla fighters, who had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation for months. While the outlaw leader positioned his men to prevent escape from above, his enemies were already moving through passages below, preparing to strike from directions he could never have anticipated. The weapons cache in the caves provided everyone with better armament than they had possessed since beginning their ordeal. But more importantly, it gave them the psychological advantage of feeling like fighters rather than victims. Even Rebecca, who had seemed broken by her captivity, handled a rifle with competence that suggested her late father had taught her the basics of frontier self-defense. "Remember," Captain Mitchell instructed as they made final preparations, "our goal is not to kill Morrison's men, but to break their will to fight. Most of these outlaws are cowards who prey on weakness. Show them strength. Show them that their victims can bite back, and they'll scatter like leaves in a windstorm." Haloki checked his weapons with the methodical precision of a warrior preparing for what might be his final battle. The Apache understood better than anyone that combat was ultimately about will rather than firepower, about the determination to continue fighting when everything seemed hopeless. Morrison's men fought for money and fear of their leader, but his own group fought for family, for justice, and for the right to live free from the predators who saw honest people as nothing more than prey. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to prophesy the bloodshed to come, both sides made their final preparations for a battle that would be remembered in frontier legend long after the last participant had returned to dust. The siege of Fortress Mesa was about to become something far more significant than a simple rescue operation. It would become the moment when ordinary people, decided they had endured enough brutality and chose to fight back against the forces that had terrorized the territory for too long. Morrison's confident shouts from below grew less frequent as his men began to realize that something was wrong, that the siege they had expected to be a simple matter of waiting out frightened civilians was becoming something far more dangerous and unpredictable than they had bargained for. The battle for Fortress Mesa began, not with the thunder of gunfire, but with the whispered prayers of ordinary people who had decided to become extraordinary. Their voices carried on desert wind that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of violence that would reshape the very soul of the territory. As purple shadows crept across the Badlands like fingers of approaching night, Captain Mitchell's carefully orchestrated plan began to unfold with the precision of a military operation and the desperation of people who understood they were fighting for far more than their own survival. From his position among the scattered boulders at the mesa's edge, Loki could see Morrison's men settling into what they clearly expected to be a comfortable siege. The outlaws had built small fires and were passing bottles among themselves, their confidence evident in the casual way they handled their weapons and the loud conversations that carried easily up the cliff face. They saw themselves as wolves surrounding helpless sheep. Unaware that the sheep had grown claws and fangs during their long captivity, Elizabeth Carter knelt beside a natural embrasure formed by two massive stones. Her father's old rifle steady in hands that had learned to milk cows and tend gardens, but were now preparing to take human life if necessary to protect her children. The transformation from frontier mother to warrior had happened so gradually that she barely recognized herself. But looking at Charles and Abigail positioned safely behind defensive barriers, she felt no doubt about the righteousness of what they were about to attempt. "Remember," Captain Mitchell whispered as she moved between the defensive positions, her own rifle equipped with a scope that spoke of serious military experience. "We strike simultaneously from 3 directions. The cave team hits Morrison's base camp exactly at sunset, the same moment we begin our assault from above. Coordination is everything. If we strike piecemeal, they'll crush us." Judge Thornton, whose judicial robes had been replaced by borrowed frontier clothing and whose gavel had been traded for a shotgun, found himself contemplating the irony of his situation. After decades of upholding law through legal procedures, he was about to dispense justice through methods that would have horrified his former colleagues. But frontier justice sometimes required frontier methods, and Morrison's crimes had long since moved beyond the reach of territorial courts. The attack began with the precision of a symphony conducted by Death himself, as multiple elements of their small force moved into action, with timing that spoke of careful planning and desperate necessity. Carmen Vasquez, leading a team through the cave system toward Morrison's lightly defended base camp, emerged from hidden passages like an avenging spirit, her intimate knowledge of the territory allowing her to position her fighters exactly where they could do the most damage. The explosion that marked the destruction of Morrison's ammunition depot echoed across the Badlands, like thunder from a clear sky, the sound rolling off canyon walls and reverberating through stone passages with such force that outlaws 20 miles away would later swear they felt the earth shake beneath their feet. The fireball that rose above the distant camp painted the evening sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to herald the end of an era of unchallenged criminal dominance. Morrison's reaction to the distant explosion was immediate and violent, his voice rising in a roar of rage that could be heard clearly by the defenders on the mesa above. "Those bastards hit the camp! Martinez, take 5 men and ride back there immediately. The rest of you, we're going up that cliff face right now, and we're going to kill every one of those." His orders were cut short by the first rifle shot from above, Captain Mitchell's bullet taking down the outlaw leader's lieutenant with surgical precision that demonstrated why she had been considered one of the finest marksmen in the territorial cavalry. The shot seemed to hang in the air for an eternal moment, before chaos erupted as outlaws scrambled for cover, while return fire began spattering against the stone defenses of the mesa. Haloki's rifle spoke with the methodical rhythm of a man who had learned to make every bullet count, each shot carefully aimed and timed to maximize psychological impact rather than simply seeking the highest body count. The Apache warrior understood that breaking an enemy's will to fight was often more effective than killing them, and his precise shooting began to convince Morrison's men that they were facing opponents far more dangerous than the helpless captives they had expected to crush. What followed was a firefight that would be talked about in frontier saloons for decades, a battle that proved ordinary people could become heroes when pushed beyond the limits of endurance by those who mistook kindness for weakness. Elizabeth Carter discovered that protecting her children could transform her into a lioness whose ferocity surprised even herself. Her shots finding targets with accuracy that spoke of desperate motivation rather than military training. Charles and Abigail, positioned behind the strongest defensive barrier but still able to observe the battle, watched their mother and their Apache protector fighting with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural. The boy, who had once trembled at his father's illness, was now calmly reloading weapons and passing ammunition, while his sister spotted targets and called out warnings with the clear voice of someone who had moved beyond fear into a realm where only survival mattered. Rebecca Mills, the traumatized young woman who had been rescued from outlaw captivity, found within herself reserves of courage that surprised everyone, including herself. Her rifle work lacked the precision of the experienced fighters, but her determination to prevent other women from suffering as she had suffered gave her shots a deadly effectiveness that sent Morrison's men scrambling for better cover. The outlaws' initial confidence began to crumble as they realized they were not facing helpless victims, but disciplined fighters who had chosen their ground well and were prepared to defend it to the death. Morrison's angry shouts revealed his growing desperation as he tried to rally men who were beginning to question whether any amount of money was worth facing enemies who fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. Judge Thornton's shotgun boomed like thunder in the confined space between the defensive barriers, its devastating close-range power discouraging any outlaw foolish enough to attempt scaling the cliff face. The elderly jurist had discovered that dispensing justice through buckshot was remarkably satisfying after years of watching criminals escape consequences through legal technicalities and corrupt officials. The battle's turning point came not through superior firepower, but through Morrison's growing realization that his entire criminal empire was collapsing around him. Reports from the few men who had managed to reach the base camp revealed total destruction. Buildings burned, supplies destroyed, and most critically, all remaining captives freed and armed by Carmen's team. The foundation of his power, built on fear and the perception of invincibility, was crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide. "Morrison!" Captain Mitchell's voice carried clearly across the battlefield, enhanced by the natural acoustics of the canyon walls. "Your camp is destroyed, your men are scattered, and your reign of terror is over. Surrender now, and you might live to see trial instead of a shallow grave." The outlaw leader's response was a stream of profanity that would have shocked a cavalry sergeant, followed by orders for a final, desperate assault on the mesa's defenses. But his words carried the hollow ring of a man who knew his situation was hopeless, and several of his remaining followers began to edge away from their positions with the careful movements of rats abandoning a sinking ship. "Okay." Haloki noticed the subtle shift in the outlaw's behavior and seized the psychological moment with the tactical instincts of a born warrior. Rising from his defensive position with complete disregard for enemy fire, he began advancing down the cliff face with movements so fluid and confident that he seemed to be walking on level ground rather than near vertical stone. The sight of an Apache warrior descending toward them like an avenging spirit proved to be more than Morrison's demoralized men could handle. One by one, they began to break from their positions, first walking quickly away from the battle, then running openly as panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. Within minutes, Morrison found himself commanding only 2 loyal followers, while the rest of his force scattered across the Badlands like leaves before a hurricane. Jake Morrison's last stand took place among the very rocks where he had expected to corner helpless victims. But instead of triumphant predator, he found himself a cornered animal facing opponents who had transformed from prey into hunters. His 2 remaining followers, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, finally abandoned their leader and fled into the gathering darkness, leaving Morrison to face alone the consequences of years spent terrorizing innocent people. Elizabeth Carter was the first to reach the bottom of the cliff. Her rifle trained on the man who had destroyed so many lives and caused so much suffering. Looking into Morrison's eyes, she saw not the fearsome outlaw leader of frontier legend, but a pathetic coward whose power had always depended on others being too weak or too frightened to fight back. "You kidnapped me," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated pain and righteous anger. "You held me in a cage like an animal. You threatened my children and tried to sell me like livestock. Give me one reason why I shouldn't kill you where you stand." Morrison's response revealed the shallow nature of his character. His words a mixture of pleading threats and promises that carried no conviction, because everyone present understood that men like him were incapable of keeping their word. He offered money, claimed he could lead them to other outlaw camps, even suggested they could work together in some kind of criminal partnership. Judge Thornton's arrival at the confrontation scene brought with it the voice of legal authority, though the elderly jurist's words carried more weight because they were backed by a shotgun than because of any territorial warrant. "Jake Morrison, by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, I place you under arrest for kidnapping, murder, operating a criminal enterprise, and numerous other charges that will see you hanged within the month." Haloke stood slightly apart from the others, his warrior's instincts still alert for danger, even though the immediate threat had passed. The Apache had seen too many supposedly defeated enemies rise from apparent death to strike one final blow, and his hand remained close to his weapons as he watched Morrison's face for signs of desperate cunning. The formal arrest of Jake Morrison marked not just the end of a criminal career, but the beginning of a new chapter in territorial law enforcement, as Judge Thornton's improvised court session demonstrated that justice could be achieved even in the remotest corners of the frontier. With Captain Mitchell serving as prosecutor and the rescued captives providing testimony, Morrison's trial became a model for how communities could take responsibility for their own protection when distant authorities proved inadequate. Carmen Vasquez's testimony about her weeks in captivity revealed the scope of Morrison's criminal network, providing information that would lead to the arrest of dozens of other outlaws and the liberation of captives held throughout the territory. Her courage in speaking publicly about her experiences inspired other victims to come forward, creating a cascade of justice that swept across the Badlands like wildfire. Rebecca Mills found healing through her testimony, the act of speaking truth about her suffering somehow diminishing the power that trauma had held over her spirit. Standing before the improvised court with her newly discovered Aunt Elizabeth beside her, she spoke with a strength that surprised everyone who had seen her broken and defeated in the outlaw prison. The reunion between Elizabeth and Rebecca continued to reveal connections that seemed almost miraculous in their timing and significance. Rebecca's possession of their family's silver locket had preserved a link to the past that allowed them to piece together Martha's journey west and understand how fate had brought them together through shared suffering and mutual rescue. Charles and Abigail listened to their mother's testimony with the wide-eyed wonder of children discovering that their parent possessed depths of courage and strength they had never imagined. The woman who had worried about winter boots and carefully counted coins at the general store had fought outlaws and helped plan military operations with the competence of a seasoned frontier warrior. As the sun set over the Badlands, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate the triumph of justice over chaos, the group of survivors found themselves contemplating futures that seemed almost impossibly bright compared to the nightmare they had endured. Morrison's conviction and sentencing to hang had effectively ended organized criminal activity in their section of the territory, while the liberation of his base camp had freed resources that could be used to help other victims rebuild their lives. Captain Mitchell's guerrilla force no longer needed to fight outlaws, transformed itself into a territorial patrol that would work with official law enforcement to prevent the rise of another criminal empire. Her military experience and knowledge of the territory made her invaluable to authorities who finally understood that maintaining order in frontier regions required people who understood both the land and the criminals who sought to exploit its vastness. Elizabeth Carter's decision to adopt Rebecca formally created a family unit that bridged the gap between past and present, honoring the memory of Martha while building something new and hopeful for the future. The silver locket that had preserved their family connection became a symbol of resilience and the unbreakable bonds that tied people together, even across great distances and seemingly impossible circumstances. Haloke's role in the rescue and battle had earned him not just gratitude, but genuine respect from territorial authorities who finally began to understand that Apache knowledge and skills could be valuable assets rather than threats to be suppressed. His tracking abilities and tactical expertise led to offers of employment that would allow him to continue protecting innocent people while bridging the cultural divide between native peoples and white settlers. Judge Thornton's unconventional court session became a model for frontier justice that was later adopted throughout the territory, proving that law and order could be maintained even in the most remote areas when communities took responsibility for their own protection. His willingness to trade judicial robes for frontier clothing and shotguns demonstrated that true authority came from moral conviction rather than official titles. The story of the rescue at Fortress Mesa spread across the territory like wildfire, growing in the telling until it became the stuff of frontier legend. But unlike many frontier tales that celebrated violence for its own sake, this story carried a different message: that ordinary people could become heroes when they chose to stand up for what was right. Regardless of the personal cost, Elizabeth Carter returned to her adobe house with her children and her newly discovered niece. But she was no longer the worried widow who had ridden to town for winter supplies. She had become a symbol of frontier strength, a woman who had faced the worst that the territory could offer and emerged victorious through courage, determination, and the willingness to fight for those she loved. The silver locket that had revealed Rebecca's true identity became a treasured family heirloom, passed down through generations as a reminder that family bonds could survive any separation and that love could triumph over even the most terrible circumstances. The story of how Elizabeth found her sister's daughter in an outlaw prison became a testament to the mysterious ways that fate could work to heal old wounds and create new possibilities. Charles and Abigail grew up with the knowledge that their mother was not just a woman who baked bread and mended clothes, but a warrior who had fought outlaws and helped bring justice to the frontier. The experience shaped their characters in ways that would influence every decision they made throughout their lives, teaching them that strength came not from avoiding danger, but from facing it with courage and determination. Haloke became a legendary figure in territorial history, his name spoken with respect by both Apache and white communities as someone who had bridged cultural divides through acts of heroism that transcended racial boundaries. His decision to help two frightened children find their missing mother had grown into something far greater, a demonstration that justice and compassion were universal values that could unite people regardless of their backgrounds. The Badlands themselves seemed to change after Morrison's defeat, as if the land itself had been cleansed of the evil that had infected it for so long. Travelers began to report that the canyons felt safer, that the wind carried different sounds, and that the very rocks seemed to stand as monuments to the triumph of good over evil. The hidden valley that had once housed Morrison's criminal empire was gradually reclaimed by the desert, its buildings crumbling and its memory fading until only scattered stories remained to mark where darkness had once held dominion. And in the end, as stars emerged over the peaceful Badlands to shine down on a territory finally free from the shadow of organized criminality, the true meaning of the rescue at Fortress Mesa became clear. It was not just a story about outlaws and gunfights, but a testament to the power of love to transform ordinary people into heroes, and to the unbreakable bonds that connected families across time, distance, and even death itself. The promise that Haloki had made to two frightened children, to find their mother and bring her home, had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. A legend that would inspire generations of frontier families to believe that no matter how dark the circumstances, courage and determination could always light the way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.